moment that would just lead to Plan B kicking in. But he did make clear that it was about the NHS coping, the NHS being under pressure. And if it is no longer sustainable, if we're going into that direction and getting there quite soon, I think that's the moment where you would see Plan B being introduced. Although, of course, as we say, businesses who would have to invoke vaccine passports, that wouldn't be immediate. There would be a week's notice. But I suppose this is really about Sajid Javid making it clear that they have many options for different eventualities. There is a confidence, but we know the government have been confident in the past and found infection rates rising at a very severe level. What will be at the centre, though, of what Boris Johnson will want to communicate today, as ever, will be the vaccine. He said that's the core of his strategy. That's the first line of defence. So a lot of the sort of encouragement, I think, will be to people who've not got vaccinated to get their vaccines, for over 50s to get their third doses, and for parents of 12 to 15-year-olds to also encourage their children to get vaccinated, not just for their own health, but for the health of the whole country. And indeed, what the government have also touched on as part of their plan is that COVAX scheme, ensuring the rest of the world gets vaccinated, and therefore that would hopefully mean that variants, which appear when the virus changes, adapts in places often where there are high infection rates, that variants can be kept to a minimum and nothing too dangerous could come into this country. That's also why we should have an update in the coming days as to the government's strategy on borders. That also is expected to change. I wouldn't expect necessarily Boris Johnson to touch on borders today. I think vaccines, Sarah, will be at the core of his message today.
Yeah, I think October the 1st was the date set out by Sajid Javid for more information on travel restrictions, wasn't it, Joe? In terms of the booster rollout, how quickly will it get underway?
Well, in a matter of days, as early as next week was one revelation today, but clearly if there are people who can get vaccinated sooner than that, I'm sure the NHS will work hard to achieve that. Boosters are for the over 50s, although over 70s are the priority. Those who work in the care sector and therefore with vulnerable people or the NHS should also be getting the boosters. Of course, there have been others, including Dame Sarah Gilbert, who was the person behind the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, who've actually said that boosters are not the best use of the millions of doses still held by the UK government. And actually, to help the world recover and to minimise the threat of variants, as I've discussed, actually, those doses would be better off being sent to developing countries. Of course, the government points out they have already put many millions of doses into the COVAX scheme. The UK government is one of the biggest donors to that scheme, and therefore they believe we are doing our part. I think, though, people will be wanting to accept their boosters. Certainly, the uptake of vaccines is pretty high in the UK, certainly compared to many other Western nations. And that is clearly a relief for Boris Johnson. He doesn't have to try quite as hard as perhaps Joe Biden does in the US to encourage people, and in some cases in the States, of course, force people, if they're working for the government, to get double jabs. It'll also be interesting to hear what the difference is between the scientists and the politicians. Boris Johnson has generally tried to be far more optimistic in these news events. He is a natural boosterist. He's not a doom-monger by nature, whereas Professor Whitty, in some extent, Sir Patrick Vallance, are often slightly more cautious, looking towards possible worst-case scenarios, looking at the data very carefully and worrying about what could suddenly happen, sudden changes that could go in a negative direction for the country.
We are expecting that news conference to get underway any moment, Joe. They are running slightly late, but we have been given our 1-minute warning. And it is an in-person news conference from the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, back face-to-face for journalists in the room. But we heard today in that Plan B, there is a contingency for people to reverting to working from home.
Yeah, clearly they want us to see a journalist in that news conference room because we are moving to life similar, back to normal. They want to, I think, show, as they didn't during the pandemic, quite what is happening. Anyway, Mr. Johnson is coming into the room.
Yeah, here we are. The Prime Minister, Professor Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance.
To set out our plan for managing COVID this autumn and winter, and I want you to cast your mind back exactly a year and think where we were last September as schools went back and the colder months approached, because in one way, our position today is actually more challenging. We have higher levels of daily cases, thousands more. But in many other crucial respects, the British people, all of us collectively and individually, are incomparably better placed to fight the disease. We have more than 80% of all over 16s now double jabbed, double vaccinated, and we have COVID antibodies in around 90% of the adult population. And those vaccines are working. We've seen the extraordinary vaccine-induced falls in deaths and serious disease, and depending on your age, you're up to 9 times more likely to die, sadly, if you're unvaccinated than if you've had both jabs. And the result of this vaccination campaign is that we have one of the most free societies and one of the most open economies in Europe. And that's why we're now sticking with our strategy. In essence, we're going to keep going. We will continue to offer testing. We'll continue to urge everyone to be sensible, to be responsible, wash your hands, use ventilation, consider wearing a face covering in crowded places with people that you don't know. Stay at home if you feel unwell. Download and use the app. And we're investing massively in our NHS to meet the pressures of COVID, with an additional 5.4 billion in England over the next 6 months. And that's on top of almost 36 billion over the next 3 years to help our NHS recover and fix the long-standing problems of social care as well, as I was saying last week. And we're helping to vaccinate the world with 100 million doses for developing countries by next June. And I think this country should be proud, continue to be very proud, that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine remains the workhorse of global immunisation. And we will keep further measures in reserve. Plan B. We do not see the need now to proceed, for instance, with mandatory certification, but will continue to work with the many businesses that are getting ready such a scheme. Indeed, over 200 events have already used COVID certification voluntarily. And it's just not sensible to rule out completely this kind of option now, when we must face the fact that it might still make the difference between keeping businesses open at full capacity or not. We will also keep open the option of mandating face coverings as they have elsewhere, or advising people again to work from home, reflecting the fact that when you've got a large proportion of the country, as we have now, with immunity, then smaller changes can make a bigger difference and give us the confidence that we don't need to go back to the lockdowns of the past. And of course, we'll continue to update our advice to you based on the latest data. But in the meantime, we are confident in the vaccines that have made such a difference to our lives. And we're now intensifying that effort, offering jabs to 12 to 15-year-olds on the advice of the chief medical officers who've given that advice based on the health, well-being and educational prospects of the children themselves. And for over 50s and the under 50s who are at risk or more at risk, we're now motoring ahead with the booster programme, a third dose 6 months after your second dose. And so that's going to mean we're going to be building even higher walls of immunisation, of vaccine protection in this country. And the UK government has procured at scale jabs for every part of the UK, and we'll be sending doses to the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. COVID is still out there. The disease, sadly, still remains a risk. But I'm confident that we can keep going with our plan to turn jabs into jobs, and protect the gains that we've made together. Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Chris, I think, to do the slides. Chris.
First slide, please. The first slide is the number of people testing positive for COVID-19 in the UK. As everybody, I think, knows, there was a significant dip during the middle part of the year, started to rise in June and July. There was a peak which then eased off, but there's been a gradual drifting up over the last few weeks. It's stabilised over the last week, but I think we should be careful neither to overinterpret nor underinterpret this. At the moment, things have stabilised to some extent, but we are, as I'll come on to, going into a more difficult period of the year. Next slide, please. And the number of people in hospital with COVID has inevitably mirrored this. And what we've seen is, again, a gradual drifting up of the number of people in hospital. It is not anywhere near yet the point it was in the first peak and in the subsequent peaks at the early part, end of last year and the beginning of this year. But there is a gentle upward trend, variable around different parts of the country. Next slide, please. The good news, of course, is that the number of people who are dying following a positive test for COVID-19 is significantly lower, proportional to the number of cases, than it was at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. But these numbers, again, are not trivial. By any means. Every one of these, of course, is a tragedy for the family. So around 140 deaths in terms of the 7-day average. And again, this is gradually drifting up, but very slowly. Broadly, this is flat to just drifting up. Next slide, please. And the number of people who've received a vaccination for COVID is also increasing, both for second doses, people who've previously been vaccinated getting their second dose to really strengthen their protection, and also for first doses. So those are the trends, and I think they've been widely circulated in various media outlets over the last few weeks, but that was just to bring people up to date. Next slide, please. We did, however, want to add just 3 additional slides because I think these make a point and reinforce the points that the Prime Minister has just made. This first slide, these are Public Health England data, shows the number of people with COVID-19 coming to emergency care within 28 days of a positive test. That just means with COVID in most cases. That led to a hospital admission by vaccination status. And what you can see is that in every age, there is a very substantially smaller proportion risk of doing this if you are vaccinated than if you're not vaccinated, in every age. And actually, if you if you sort of just do a very crude look at the numbers, someone who is in their 30s and unvaccinated is running about the same risk as someone in their 70s who is vaccinated. It's that level of difference. And I really want to reinforce why people of every age should be trying to get vaccinated. And one of the most depressing things for doctors, including myself, is talking to people who have just chosen not to get vaccinated because it wasn't convenient at that particular moment, and you see them being wheeled down to intensive care, and you know this was a very serious problem as a result of them not being vaccinated. We really must encourage everybody we know to get vaccinated. The great majority of people who have not been vaccinated is not because they're against vaccination, but because they just haven't got to doing it. And we're about to enter winter. Winter is coming, and people really should take this seriously. Next slide, please. And this is even more clear if you look at the mortality rates, which again are very starkly different between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated. So I really would encourage, and I'm sure all of you would encourage, everybody we know to get vaccinated and then double vaccinated. So the 3 sort of layers of defence from vaccination, 2 new. The first one, children and young people 12 to 15, which we talked about yesterday. Today, discussion of people getting their booster doses, who've already had 2 vaccines and getting a third. But the third, and arguably the most important, is that people who've had no vaccines should be encouraged to get their first and then their second vaccination. This is really critical. Next slide, please. And the final point, really, with the data, is this is a comparison of where we are now, and this reinforces very much the point the Prime Minister made at the beginning of his opening remarks. In 2021, in the orange line, and along the bottom is the dates, and where we were in 2020. And what you can see in this is that this time last year, we were only beginning to get the takeoff that you see in autumn and into winter. And we're entering the autumn and winter period at a much higher level in terms of number of cases, in terms of number of hospitalizations, and in terms of number of deaths than we were this time last year. And the reason that it's possible for that to be happening, and the NHS under extreme pressure, but not at the point where it was by any means at the turn of the year, is because of vaccination. But we are entering the winter with this reasonably high level. It wouldn't take many doubling times to get into trouble, and therefore people still need to take this disease very seriously, because I don't think you need a medical degree to know that autumn and winter is when respiratory viruses are hugely advantaged, flu and others, as people come together indoors, windows closed and so on. So it was really just a reinforcement to people. If you've not had your vaccination, now is a very good time to do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. Patrick, anything to add to that? Let's go to questions there. Thanks very much. Let's go to questions from the public. First, Michael from Dorset. Michael asks, the government suggested in March 2020 that 20,000 deaths from COVID-19 would be a good result. Why then is the PM not doing anything to prevent even more unnecessary deaths? Well, Michael, I'm not certain that that was what we suggested, but what we are doing, of course, with all our policies and everything we've done since the beginning of the pandemic is to prevent unnecessary deaths. Everyone has been a tragedy, but I think I'm right in saying that I think I saw a statistic from Public Health England saying that the vaccination programme alone had saved perhaps 100,000 lives, maybe 120,000 lives, and that's why what Chris has just said about getting your jab is so absolutely crucial. Thank you, Michael. Kirsty from Leeds. Can the government advise on when the strict travel rules will ease further for those that are fully vaccinated and advise on what determines a country's list? At the moment, travellers are confused about where they can go when countries that have low COVID rates and good vaccinations are still red. Thanks very much, Kirsty. I appreciate that people are very frustrated about the travel rules, but it is vital that we do whatever we can to stop the virus being re-imported, and particularly to control new variants when they're at risk of coming in. That's why we have the rules. That's why we have the red lists. And I know that travellers have been frustrated this summer in having to take tests in order to do it. But I think it is reasonable to ask people to do that to help protect the population. We'll be saying a lot more shortly, Kirsty, about the traffic light system, about simplifying it, and about what we can do to make the burdens of testing less onerous for those who are coming back into the country, Kirsty. But that will be coming shortly. Let's go to questions from the media. Vicky Young from BBC News.
Prime Minister, could I just start on behalf of all of us by extending our condolences to you and your family after the loss of your
Thank you very much.
Could you tell us in what circumstances you would impose those extra restrictions, your plan B? Do you have a number of cases, a number of hospital admissions, which would mean that we've passed that threshold? And a similar question really to Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick. When do you think extra restrictions should be imposed?
Well, Kirsty, Vicky, sorry. First of all, thank you very much for your kind words, and to many others who've said the same. But on your point about Plan B and when it and how and what the trigger might be for that, I think that just bear in mind what we're trying to prevent, and that is the overwhelming of the NHS, and that's got to remain the objective. There are all sorts of data that we'll continue to study, as we have throughout the pandemic, in deciding what the risks are, what the state of the disease is. We'll keep you updated about where we are. You've heard the exact state of things at the moment, and we're confident we can proceed with Plan A. But I think what I would stress about Plan B is that it contains a number of different shots in the locker, and you wouldn't necessarily play them all at once. Far from it. You'd want to do things in a graduated way. And I just emphasise what I think Patrick has said many times, that we're now in a situation when, because so many of the population have some degree of immunity, smaller changes in the guidance, smaller changes in the way we're asking people to behave can have a bigger impact, and a smaller tilt on the tiller, if you want, can affect a bigger change in the direction of the pandemic. And maybe Patrick can say more about that if you want. Patrick, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we've got high levels of immunity now, and if, as Chris said, we can get everybody who's not vaccinated to be vaccinated, so that's the most important thing we can do. There are 5 million or so people who are eligible for vaccines now who haven't been vaccinated, and trying to persuade those people it's the right thing to do to get vaccinated would make a significant difference. So getting that immunity up means that then the barrier against rises is that much greater. If you think about where we are now with infection rates and the openness that we've currently got, if you tried to do this 6 months ago, the number of cases and deaths and hospitalizations would be through the roof. So the immunity is really important to keep this down, and allows lighter measures to be put in place to keep it under control. That said, the things to look at are hospitalizations. They are really, really important as a marker of when things are going in the wrong direction, and the relationship between cases and hospitalizations, because one of the things the vaccines has done is made that relationship really much less. So if you saw that changing again, that would be a cause for concern. So those are things to look at. And the final thing to say is that the principles which have been really clear, I think, right the way across the world, are when you make a move, you have to go earlier than you think you want to, you have to go harder than you think you want to, and you need to make sure you've got the right geographical coverage. So if this goes in the wrong direction and cases go up, followed by hospitalizations, it's important that the measures are put in place early enough and they're significant enough.
Thanks.
I'd just add slightly to that, PM. I mean, I think, in addition to what PM and Patrick have said, I mean, there are three things which I think is worth looking at. The first of which is the absolute numbers going into hospital. The second, though, is the rate of change. A gradual drift up is one thing. If you suddenly saw a very rapid increase, then you have to consider taking earlier action. And the third of which is the overall state of the NHS, which, of course, does vary over the year. And as you go into winter, there tend to be greater pressures. So these are all the kinds of things that will need to be taken into account. But no one is claiming there is a good number. We would all like the numbers to be as low as possible. But in terms of what might trigger change, those are the things which I think are the most likely.
Good. Thank you very much. Robert Pesson, ITV.
Obviously, we're all relieved at the way in which the vaccine reduces severe disease. Actually, I've just myself recovered from COVID, double vaxxed. But as your chart showed, numbers going in hospital are 5 times what they were a year ago. Sorry, 4 times actually. Deaths are 5 times what they were a year ago. And as you pointed out, we're about to get colder weather. We're going to be indoors more. Kids are going back to school. What is the argument for not taking mild suppressive measures now as a preventative measure? And separately, on boosters, you'll have seen the Lancet paper, scientists from the WHO, American FDA and others, and we've seen what Sarah Gilbert said in Oxford. The argument for, in their view, the argument for boosters is not overwhelming, and many of those people think we'd be doing a better job sending those vaccines to countries that haven't got any vaccines at all at the moment, particularly places like Africa. Why do you disagree with that judgment? Because it is an important judgment difference.
What was that aimed at?
Well, the scientists for the latter one, and all of you for the question of why not take, prophylactic action, even of a mild sort, now.
I just say to you, Robert, on that, because the vaccines have made a huge difference in reducing mortality. So the ratio of cases to serious disease and deaths is vast, and we are continuing to advise everybody to be sensible and responsible. So Plan A, what we're doing at the moment, continues to continue to think about using a face covering in a confined space when you're meeting people you don't know. Wash your hands, use ventilation, get a test, stay at home if you feel unwell. These are very, very important restrictions that I think people, or ways we behave responsibly, that people should continue to maintain. But I think that's the right balance, given where the pandemic is at the moment and given what we've been able to achieve. And I think that the priority should be for there are literally 5 million more people who could get a vaccination and who haven't yet done so. And those are the people that I think we should be encouraging now to come forward, get your jab. It will be good for you for the numbers, the reasons that Chris has set out. You're overwhelmingly more likely, sadly, to die or to suffer serious disease if you haven't been vaccinated. And so vaccination, I think, should be the key thing we advocate.
I'd like to add to that. So, firstly, on the measures, if we had a situation where everybody was back to behaving as they did prior to March 2020, we would have a much higher rate than we do at the moment. So actually, people are taking measures. Everybody's taking, but lots of people are taking measures. They're meeting with fewer people. Good research demonstrate that. Many people are wearing masks in crowded places and all the other things that the Prime Minister has talked about. So it's not that we're not taking measures. There are quite a lot of measures, and lots of people, probably the great majority of people still, are taking some or a lot of measures to reduce the risk that they and other people get infected, in addition to being vaccinated, which, as the Prime Minister has said, is the most important thing. So I think we shouldn't just say there's nothing happening, there clearly already is. On boosters, I think it's important to separate out two things, which I think if they get conflated, leads to confusion. The first one, which everyone would agree with, and the Prime Minister said in his remarks, is everybody agrees we want to get vaccines out all around the world, including low-income countries. That is an absolute moral imperative. It is also an absolute practical imperative for everybody, and everybody agrees with that. That isn't a contentious point. The second question is there some waning of immunity that means that a third dose, a booster dose, is a sensible thing to do? And I think there is now reasonably good evidence that that is the case. The UK has taken, in a sense, a middle way on this, led by the JCVI. It has neither said no boosters at all, because there is evidence of waning, particularly at the top end of the age range and in those who've got pre-existing health conditions. And those are the groups that JCVI have actually recommended it, in addition to health and social care workers, because of the chance that this is going to reduce the probability they will infect others. So there's a very good logic, but they've not gone all the way of recommending universal boosters for everybody. So they've taken a middle path, which some nations have gone for. But the logic of the boosters for the UK is, I think, is clear and science-based, and the ethical imperative, as well as the overall need to do that, I think, is widely agreed. And those two, I think, are separate discussions. If we suddenly stopped having boosters, given the particular vaccines we're using, which are the mRNA ones with very ultra-cold cold chains, actually at the moment not long, very long shelf lives, the idea that's somehow going to transform the situation in lower-income countries, I think, is a misunderstanding. I think those are separate issues, but both are important.
Yeah, just to build on that, and I agree completely with what Chris has said, if you think about the degree of immunity we've got and the levels of behavioural restriction that people have imposed upon themselves, so people aren't meeting as many people. We know contact patterns are still quite a long way down compared to where they were, but they are changing quite fast. The faster they change, the more pressure this is going to come under, and that may well lead to a significant increase. If you look at, go just across the channel, countries where you've got similar levels of immunity and some higher degrees of restriction, what you can see is that the cases are going down. So you can see we're sort of at that pivot point where things are flattish at the moment. If they go up quickly, then, as I've said, you've got to go early in terms of getting on top of it. You can't wait till it's late because you have to do more. So that's sort of where we are on that. And on the boosters, the waning of immunity is clear. It's greater for infection than it is for the waning against hospitalizations and deaths. So they're holding up very well. And I want to just say the really important point is these vaccines are really good. They are really effective vaccines, far more effective than we could dare have hoped for at the beginning. So this is some waning. And that waning is most evident in the people who are at most at risk. And so getting on and getting that topped up does two things. It gives a very high level of antibody coverage, and it probably broadens the coverage across variants as well, because you've got such high response. So I think it's a sensible thing to do. JCVI have considered it very carefully, and I think their recommendation is a very sensible one.
Great, thanks. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4.
Thank you very much. Professor Whitty, you talked a bit about the metrics for how we might decide we've got to move from Plan A to Plan B, lockdown light, maybe. What about the trigger? Is it most likely, do you think, that it'll be a new variant that would actually change the game here? Is that the real game changer that you'd be expecting to transform the horizon there? And when the Prime Minister said he would urge people to consider wearing a face mask in crowded indoor places, you say we're in a very serious condition. Is considering it enough? And Prime Minister, on vaccine passports, you said in this building in July you served notice that you're planning to bring them in. Were you really planning to bring them in? Were you just trying to get the numbers up of younger vaccination? We've then had lots of other mixed messaging, which isn't great in public health. What's going on?
Chris, you want to go first on that?
Thank you. In terms of new variants, certainly new variants are one of the things we need to look seriously at. Now, of course, variants are happening the whole time, have always happened. What we need, the worry would be one that can escape from the vaccination. So the Delta variant is a very bad variant. I mean, let's be very clear, it's a very bad variant, and that's the reason we've had such trouble in the last year, as every country around the world. We have not faced a winter with the Delta variant. So it is possible that the combination of winter events plus the Delta variant, which is highly transmissible, could lead to a situation where, on the basis of the data, ministers decided that they wanted to trigger all or some of the Plan B, as the Prime Minister's laid out. So I think we have to take it as it comes. I think anybody who can say with confidence they know how this is going to work over the next few months has not fully understood, I think, the range of possible ways this could happen. But certainly, were there to be a variant that was both transmissible and escaped from the vaccines, that would put us in a new situation. And no doubt the Prime Minister would come back and explain where he wished to go at that point in time. But we're not at that point in time. I think at the moment our expectation is the Delta variant, but over autumn and winter is what we face at the moment. And then in terms of masks, I think my previous suggestion to people remains my view, which is if you are in a crowded environment, particularly if you're in an indoor space, wearing a mask is a way of helping protect other people. Being vaccinated really helps protect them, but it's not a complete protection. People can get infected and they can transmit vaccinated. There's much lower probability to both of those. Wearing a mask helps to reduce that. It's not something you need to concern yourself so much if you're outdoors in highly ventilated areas. And the other area where I think it is sensible is if actually you've got people around you who wish you to do so, either because they've got medical conditions or simply because that is their desire. I consider it an issue of common courtesy. There are a number of situations you would want to wear a mask, but that's not universal, and it's a recommendation. It's not something which the government has put into regulation.
Excellent, thank you. And look, just Gary, on your point about COVID certification and vaccine passports, as it were, I really do defend these in principle. I think it was right to set out in July that we could go forward with those measures. And actually, what has happened is, I mean, if you think about a year ago, where we were, last September, can you imagine if we'd had then COVID certification, we would have been able, with that tool, to keep open businesses that had been forced to close and were going through an absolutely wretched time. There would have been a total game changer, a lifesaver last year. And so I think that they're important part of our repertoire. And it's great that loads of events have been working to use them. People have been making the system work. And as I said earlier on, we may because of where the disease gets to, we may have to use them in a more thoroughgoing way. We reserve the right to come back to you and say we think that that's going to be necessary. And I do think the public understand that. They can see how it could work. There are plenty of other countries that are doing it right now. But at present, we don't think it's necessary to proceed on that that basis. We think that we can keep going with all the stipulations that I mentioned and Chris reinforced that we're asking people to observe. We think that's the right balance given where the data is now. But you've got to be mindful that this disease does have a way of changing and moving. What is absolutely for certain is the vaccine's made a vast difference. And if what I hope people take away from this press conference, above all, is not perhaps the importance of Plan A or Plan B, but that fixing that gap in the number of people who have had their vaccine of whatever age, and that statistic about the risks to an unvaccinated person in their 30s seem to be very, very powerful. And I would just, the numbers are going up, and it's very encouraging to see how many people are coming forward to get vaccinations. And I would just urge everybody who, is still a bit apathetic about it to join the club, because it's, worthwhile. Steve Swinford, The Times.
Prime Minister. Professor Whitty, one of the world's biggest female celebrities, Nicki Minaj, has today publicly linked the coronavirus vaccines to impotence. Now, she's got 8 million followers on Twitter. Many of them are young people, the young people you're suggesting should get vaccinated. What would you say to them, and how concerned are you by public comments like that from public figures? Prime Minister, SAGE and SPI-M have both advised that the government, that working from home is one of the single most effective measures at reducing transmission. But looking at your autumn and winter plan, it's not actually part of Plan B. It seems to kind of hover as some kind of Plan C with a decision on its shelf for a later date when we actually look at the document. Why are you more reticent about deploying working from home to combat this? And one last question. Prime Minister, a lot of your Cabinet are feeling very anxious as we're gathered here today about their own futures. Can you formally rule out a reshuffle ahead of the Conservative Party conference?
Chris, on the reshuffle.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So there are a number of myths that fly around with varying, some of which are just clearly ridiculous and some of which are clearly designed just to scare. That happens to be one of them. That is untrue. My own strong suggestion, if I may, to media present and not present, is repeating them in public actually just gives them credence, which they don't need. They're untrue, full stop. If you think about where we are actually overall, and this is a slightly longer answer to your question because I think it's a very important one, the great majority of people are getting vaccinated. So the great majority of people are ignoring these myths. And if you talk about people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, you're talking about over 90% of people getting vaccinated, and very few people actually are actively, in a sense, in the anti-vax group. There are a group of people who've got strange beliefs, and fine, and they make their own choices, and in a sense, also fine. Adults are allowed to make their own choices, however strange. That is a basic principle of medical ethics, actually. But there are also people who go around trying to discourage other people from taking a vaccine which could be life-saving or prevent them from having life-changing injuries to themselves. And many of those people, I regret to say, I think know that they are peddling untruths, but they still do it. In my view, they should be ashamed. And I'll leave it at that.
And just on that, Steve, I'm not familiar with the works of, or not as familiar with the works of Nicki Minaj as I probably should be, but I am familiar with Nikki Kanani, superstar GP of Bexley, who's appeared many times on before you, who will tell you that vaccines are wonderful and everybody should get them. So I prefer to listen to Nikki Kanani. And on your point about working from home, this is one of those things where I think just look at what the public are doing. I think people are coming back to their offices. That you're seeing the numbers that I'm reading suggest that people are more confident. They're getting back into their places of work. For the reasons I've given many times before, I think that that's a good thing. I think that on the whole, particularly for younger people, you need the social capital you get from the workplace. You need the learning from colleagues. I think that will, on the whole, be more productive and it's fairer to everybody if we can do that. But people are also being sensible and responsible. If we have to change the guidance that we give on that, then we will. But that's Plan B. you've heard earlier on.
Can I just add to that, Prime Minister? I mean,
Yes.
the point about something like working from home, it's about contact patterns. And in a way, this is all quite straightforward, that the disease spreads much more rapidly the more contacts we have. And in certain environments, the more contacts you have are more risky. And working from home is just a way in which contacts inevitably go down. So that's why it was highlighted as a particularly effective measure to decrease spread at times when you have big increases in levels.
Thanks. Lizzie Buck in the Mirror.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You've spoken about reserving the right to use vaccine passports, and the Plan B document states that they could be imposed for nightclubs and large venues, but it doesn't entirely rule them out mandating them more widely. Are you considering imposing them in pubs, or would you like to rule that out? And to the scientists, what are your views on the evidence behind the use of vaccine passports? PHE found that they mitigate the risk of transmission, so why are we not using them now?
Thanks very, very much. But no, Lizzie, look, I've never been in favour of vaccine passports for pubs. I've been, I think, pretty clear about that throughout the pandemic. But I do think that there are settings, as we put it, nightclubs, large music venues, and so on, or venues with big, closely packed crowds, where they might be appropriate. As we all know, some events have been using them over the summer very effectively to get going, and I think it would be sensible for a government not to rule that out.
In terms of the question to us, I mean, the question about whether it's a passport is entirely a one for political leaders. That's a legislative and societal one. From the science point of view, though, I think nobody would doubt that you're safer off if you go to any indoor venue where everyone around you is vaccinated. It reduces the probability they will get COVID at all. It reduces the probability if they do have COVID, they will pass it on. And if everybody in the environment is vaccinated, the chance of a mass spreading event is very substantially reduced because everybody's got it. So things that are to encourage everybody to get vaccinated, particularly if they're going to large mass events indoors, the evidence that is going to be a good idea is rock solid. How that's done is very much a matter for ministers.
Good, thank you. Adam Payne, Politics Home.
Thanks, Prime Minister. A question for you, please, on the potential mandating of vaccine passports. Michael Kill, who's the CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association, told Politics Home today that the government's handling of this issue has been chaotic and that Plan B could force nightclubs and venues to make massive logistical changes at a moment's notice. What's your message to Michael and that industry, and to Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick, please? Do you have any data on the effectiveness of the booster shot? Professor Ferguson yesterday said a study in Israel suggested people were 10 times less likely to catch mild disease after receiving a third dose. Do either of you have any information you can share on that, please?
Yes, thanks very much, Adam. On nightclubs and the whole nighttime economy, we want to keep it open. And the big difference between this year and last year is that thanks to vaccination, we are able to keep it open. It's a great thing. We just have to be sensible and look at the risks that we face. And I think that some sort of COVID certification system of a kind that plenty of venues have been using already might well be sensible. We're working with the industry, including the nightclub industry, to make sure that they understand what could be required of them. And of course, I understand the frustrations of people who are wondering whether or not they're going to have to put this in. At the moment, we're confident that you won't, that we'll be able to proceed without it. But the choice is, and the reason for wanting to have this option is because it's a choice that then between proceeding with COVID certification or sadly once again asking places to close. And I certainly don't want to do that. So that's why I think it's a good idea to keep this up our sleeve and keep this in reserve.
And on boosters, I mean, it's very clear that the booster shots cause a very big increase in antibody responses, and that would be expected to have a very big knock-on effect for protection in terms of infection and hospitalizations and death. So I think the data look pretty clear on that.
One just final point, which is on the first one. I think there's a lot of people believe young people aren't taking up the vaccine. Not true. The great majority of people 16 to 29 have already taken up their first vaccine and are taking up their second. So the idea that this is just a minority of younger people who haven't is completely untrue, and we should always start from that basis.
That's right. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that was the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, alongside the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, giving their update on the winter COVID plan. The Prime Minister outlined Plan A, which relies on booster vaccines being rolled out for the over 50s, and Plan B, which he said is only to come in certain scenarios. We do not see the need now, he said, to proceed with mandatory certification, but it's not sensible to rule out completely this kind of option now. And that, of course, Plan B is COVID vaccine certificates for certain settings, mandating face masks in certain settings, asking people to work from home. We are confident, the Prime Minister said, in the vaccines, and we're now intensifying that effort. There was a real boost, a real push from the three gentlemen there to encourage the 5 million people who are eligible for vaccines and haven't yet had one to take up the offer of a vaccine. Also, 12 to 15-year-olds to be invited for vaccines and that booster programme. The PM described it as building even higher walls of immunisation and vaccine protection in this country. We are confident, he said, we can continue with our plan to turn jabs into jobs. Professor Chris Whitty set out some of the data. He said that cases have been stabilising over the past week, but we are going into a difficult period of the year. Hospitalizations have gradually been drifting up, but nowhere near the peaks of the first and second waves. Deaths, the number is significantly lower compared to case numbers, but at around 140 a day on the 7-day average, it is drifting up very slowly. 44 million people are now fully vaccinated. On the importance of the vaccination, Professor Chris Whitty gave us some indication. He said someone in their 30s who is unvaccinated is running the same risk as someone in their 70s who is vaccinated. We got a bit more information about what might trigger Plan B from the scientists. So they said they would be looking at all of the data. They'd be looking at hospitalizations, not just the number, but the rate of change. If we started to see a surge in the numbers of hospitalizations, generally the state of the NHS, everyone knowing that winter is a difficult time. So the relationship between cases and hospitalizations. Sir Patrick Vallance saying you've got to go early enough and ensure that any measures brought in are significant enough. So a word of caution from the scientific advisors. They were also asked about the rapper Nicki Minaj, who has been sending tweets about coronavirus vaccines. They are myths designed to scare, Professor Chris Whitty said, clearly untrue. Repeating them in public gives credence. They are untrue, full stop. There are many people, he said, who know they are peddling untruths and go on doing it anyway. In my view, they should be ashamed of themselves. Well, let's have a listen now to the Prime Minister as he set out his COVID winter plan during that Downing Street news conference.
The result of this vaccination campaign is that we have one of the most free societies and one of the most open economies in Europe. And that's why we're now sticking with our strategy. In essence, we're going to keep going. And we will keep further measures in reserve. Plan B. We do not see the need now to proceed, for instance, with mandatory certification, but will continue to work with the many businesses that are getting ready such a scheme. Indeed, over 200 events have already used COVID certification voluntarily. And it's just not sensible to rule out completely this kind of option now, when we must face the fact that it might still make the difference between keeping businesses open at full capacity or not.
Well, the Prime Minister was joined by the Chief Scientific Advisor Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, who emphasised the importance of getting vaccinated, especially as winter approaches.
One of the most depressing things for doctors, including myself, is talking to people who have just chosen not to get vaccinated because it wasn't convenient at that particular moment, and you see them being wheeled down to intensive care, and you know this was a very serious problem as a result of them not being vaccinated. We really must encourage everybody we know to get vaccinated. The great majority of people who have not been vaccinated is not because they're against vaccination, but because they just haven't got to doing it. And we're about to enter winter. Winter is coming, and people really should take this seriously.
Well, the government has released the latest data about the UK's coronavirus outbreak. There have been a further 26,628 new cases of coronavirus reported in the latest 24-hour period. A further 185 people have died after contracting COVID. That takes the total number of people who've died within 28 days of a positive test to 134,446. Another 19,428 first doses of a COVID vaccine have been given, while 60,653 people received their second dose. In total, more than 44.1 million people are now fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Now, after that news conference, I was just summarising and gave you some details about Professor Chris Whitty when he was asked about false information about COVID and the vaccines being posted on Twitter. This is his response to that question.
There are a number of myths that fly around with varying, some of which are just clearly ridiculous and some of which are clearly designed just to scare. That happens to be one of them. That is untrue. There are also people who go around trying to discourage other people from taking a vaccine which could be life-saving or prevent them from having life-changing injuries to themselves. And many of those people, I regret to say, I think know that they are peddling untruths, but they still do it. In my view, they should be ashamed.
Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is in Downing Street for us. Hello to you, Beth. An interesting news conference with the Prime Minister setting out Plan A and Plan B, and a bit more information from the scientists about what might lead us into those extra measures of Plan B.
Yes, sorry, but I think the thing for me out of that press conference was when Professor Ritty said we've got to really take it as it comes. He said we've not faced a winter with Delta variants, so these combinations of winter when it's already more transmissible, the NHS already under stress as we know, and this particular Delta variant which we know is more transmissible, well, he said we've just got to see how it goes, and that definitely was the feeling of that press conference. No one refusing to rule anything in or out. I think the closest we got was when the Prime Minister said he really did not want to have COVID passports for pubs. But as for everything else, well, it seems to be that the government has decided that they will, at the moment, really push for vaccinations. They talked about that 6 million of us who are eligible, people that haven't been vaccinated, and then, of course, 12 to 15-year-olds from next week, they'll be offered a first dose. That's another 3 million children that could have doses of the vaccine. A big push on that in order to try and prevent all the other options in that Plan B for having to be put forward. That's mandatory wearing of masks, the use of COVID passports in big venues, and of course even the potential for working at home. home, what was clear was that there was a sliding scale, if you like, of measures all designed to avoid a potential lockdown. The Prime Minister saying there, as they have said in the winter plan, that they don't think that will be necessary with all the other tools in the toolkit, but refusing to rule it out. And what would be the trigger? Well, the transmissibility of the Delta variant and, of course, a big spike in hospitalizations. And that was what Sir Chris Whitty was talking about, that he was looking to. What are the hospital numbers? And then, of course, what's the link between hospitalizations and deaths? Now, they didn't put numbers on it, but they certainly said that that's what they would look at. And also, I thought what finally was very interesting was Sir Patrick Vallance, when he was asked about what could happen this autumn. He said, the thing is, when you decide to take a measure, you should go early and it should be significant enough. Now, was that a nod to what happened last autumn when the Prime Minister dragged his heels on that circuit breaker and then we ended up with all those regional lockdowns, eventually having that Christmas lockdown and then a 3 months of lockdown in the new year? So maybe a veiled message there from Sir Patrick Vallance to politicians about not delaying if the numbers start going in the wrong direction.
Beth, thanks very much indeed. Beth Ripley there in Downing Street. This is Sky News. Coming up, baseless, unviable and potentially unlawful. Prince Andrew's lawyer on the claims of sexual assault made against him as a lawsuit is launched by his accuser.
It's estimated that around 70% of our coastlines are experiencing increased erosion. We start with a steel structure that we put into the seafloor. We then pass a very small electrical current between what we call an anode and the cathode, and the structure itself is the cathode.